Hello and welcome to Lenric's realm. I am Matt and in this video I am painting my Oldhammer Warcry Warband in black, white and red. When painting miniatures or building terrain pieces, we often strive for one ideal, making it as real as possible. We try to have the most accurate skin tones, or we want to get that beautiful, glinting, non-metallic metal silver sword. Seeing all these beautiful, artistic and realistic pieces makes you wonder how to achieve something like that, especially if you just started out with a hobby. On one hand, this strive for realism is great and can motivate you to get better at miniature painting. Sometimes, however, it can be a little frustrating if you don't get the exact results you want to achieve. I for myself struggle with non-metallic metal and always revert back to using metallic paints. And although I'm happy with the results in the end, I always feel I could have done it better. This bothers me, to be honest. I want this hobby to be fun, and although I want to become better or more skilled with the craft, I don't want to associate disappointment with it. For that reason, I looked for a project to detach myself a bit from the realistic approach and tried something more abstract and, well, monochromatic. If you have seen my video about the Warhammer Online inspired tavern, you may remember that the first miniatures I bought back in the early 2000s were a small selection of Dark Elves. Now, I do not own enough to build a proper Age of Sigmar or even a Warhammer Fantasy army, but I thought they would be pretty awesome for Warcry Anvilgard Warband. And with the release of the free 2.0 updates from Games Workshop, nice move by the way, there was nothing that stood in my way. Now, I have to admit it feels kinda like a meta commentary to use a black and white color scheme on a miniature line that is no longer being produced. But that was not my intention. What was my intention, however, was to have something special for these miniatures. But before I could start to paint these miniatures, I needed bases. As Dark Elves live in a pretty brutal society, I imagined a warband standing on a battlefield riddled with weapons and bones of their enemies. So, standard Warhammer stuff. For that I needed an important ingredient from my little crafting kitchen, this box of skulls by Games Workshop. With these and a few bits from my bits box, I started to build my bases. As a first step, I used bark chips to give my Dark Elves a small platform to stand on and to give them the advantage of the tactical rock. I used superglue to adhere them to the base and also to seal the bark chips. Then I glued skulls, bones and weapons to the base, for which I used plastic cement. After that, I removed the slot inserts on the models and pinned them to give them better adhesion to the bases. The superglue bond alone is very brittle and not very reliable, especially if you use your miniatures for playing. I also noticed some parts of the model floating in the air, so I took a few small bark pieces and squeezed them between the mini and the bark on the base. All held together, of course, with superglue. Now here I recommend wearing a protective mask that can filter out fumes. Using superglue in this quantity isn't very healthy for you, no matter how open your window is. And at this point the warband was ready for painting. My first step was to prime the whole warband in black. I also gave the miniatures a zenithal with a light grey and a white on top. Those two steps were the only steps I made with the airbrush, and in the end a simple black prime would have been enough. I prepared my wet palette with two paints, white and black. In this case I used Chimera paints, but seriously, the paint brand doesn't really matter at all here. I mixed a few gradients of grey and started working on the pieces. For the cloaks of the Corsairs, I simply based them with a dark grey and used lighter and lighter grey tones moving to the top. After that, I gave those scales a wash of GW's Nuln oil. I usually prefer to use oil washes on my miniatures, but in this particular case, this acrylic wash had a desired effect of not only going into the recesses, but also staining the scales a bit. This way the cloak looked a bit more uniform. I went back in with normal paints and highlighted the scales. When playing a wargame, you want your miniatures to be readable from a certain distance. Now, an army of black and white miniatures would probably fail at that specific task. For that reason, I decided to add a little bit more color into the mix. The probably loudest and most attention-grabbing tone is red. This color almost screams at you, and every other color in its vicinity seems to be reduced to a silent bystander. Red can be aggressive, strong, and signalize danger. Thematically, this is a perfect fit for dark elves. So to make them more distinct and better readable on the battlefield, I decided to paint a few special parts, mostly parts of the weapons, in red. I went with this pure pigment red, also from Chimera. This stuff is so highly saturated, it creates a stark contrast with the monochromatic rest of the miniatures. To keep the saturation high, I also decided against using black and white while mixing shades and highlights for the red parts. Instead, I mixed the red with the violet for the shadows and with this warm yellow for the highlighted areas. For the armor parts, I decided to try to get some kind of non-metallic metal effect. I knew I needed to put highlights and shadows close together to achieve this effect, and on some part it actually kinda worked well. On the weapons, I decided not to go with the non-metallic metal approach. I simply went in with highlighting the edge of the blade. The red on the blade would be a distraction either way. In the end, I painted the base in the same monochromatic scheme. I mostly used stippling here to get some texture and variation to the rocks, skulls and weapons, but I also deliberately applied a few small white highlights to make the details more distinct. And here is my Oldhammer Warcry Warband ready for battle. I'm really happy about this more unusual approach, and more importantly, I don't have this nagging feeling it's not realistic enough. Painting is a creative process, and sometimes creativity also means working around certain limitations. I hope you like this video. If you do, why not leave a like, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. I really want to show you more of my miniature journey in the future and to hear about your miniature related achievements in the comments below. Until then, thank you for watching and farewell, fellow adventurers.